right, our final speaker today is going to be speaking on the effect of American foreign policy on Muslim communities. It is an honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Robert Riggs. Dr. Riggs has a PhD in Arabic and Islamic Studies from the University of Pennsylvania, where he is focused on contemporary history of the Middle East. He currently is an assistant professor of religion and politics at the University of Bridgeport, where he teaches courses on Islam and democracy, Islamic world, introduction to Islam, and Muslim, Christian, and Jewish relations in the modern Middle East, and political economy of the Middle East. Again, it's another honor and privilege, and I'm very thankful. Dr. Robert Riggs.
Thank you. There's so many different directions I could go with this kind of a talk. So what I did was I excerpted some parts of a very concise version of my entire semester on Islam democracy, because a lot of it's related to how the U.S. foreign policy has screwed up the Middle East and a lot of other places, and then I'm going to try to tie that into how that affects American Muslim communities, because as Dr. Abu's name said, at least maybe a third or more of American Muslims are immigrants or children of immigrants who have many family members in the countries where U.S. foreign policy is disastrously affecting their extended family. And so you have to think in terms of the bi-directional influence of U.S. foreign policy, right? On the one hand, they're living here in America, enjoying their kind of peaceful and tolerant, pluralistic society, living like any other American community in freedom and generally peacefully, and fully American citizens, many of the children of immigrants, of course, identifying as themselves firstly as American. But then you have grandma living in the West Bank, and first cousin Khalid, who's being arrested by the Israeli secret police in the middle of the night and thrown in jail without any habeas corpus, right? So that kind of gives you an introduction to what I want to talk about. But first, let me just say a couple words as follow-up to the whole Al Jazeera issue. Al Jazeera, as our former speaker said, it started in 1996. It was the first cable satellite news station in the Middle East, and it was groundbreaking at the time because up until that point, if you lived in a Middle Eastern country and you spoke Arabic, your access to news was basically newspapers or state television. When I lived in Jordan in the year 2000 to 2002, there was Channel 1, 2, and 3. Channel 1 was Malik Abdullah all the time, right? King Abdullah 100% of the time. Channel 2 was sports, and Channel 3 was American movies, I think. Or maybe I mixed them up. I don't know. You'll have to correct me. And all of a sudden, Al Jazeera kind of bursts onto the scene. Everybody's getting satellite TV. And it was the first chance for people to see real debate, just like what Abdul Shakur said. Right? All of a sudden, you hear people criticizing their leaders. So actually, Al Jazeera was a big force in terms of furthering democratic process in the Middle East, at least. What happened is, this is when I was in Qatar. I was presenting at a conference at the Islamic Studies faculty in Qatar Foundation, and we took a trip to Al Jazeera, and they went into Arabic. They have an Arabic, the original Al Jazeera, which is in Arabic, and then across the street they have Al Jazeera English. When I went in there, they had this massive display of all the international awards they've won across the globe for their reporting. And I asked the people there, I said, well, who runs Al Jazeera English? Is it run by the guys across the street? And they were like, no, they have their entire separate editorial staff that has nothing to do with Al Jazeera Arabic, because the reporting is actually different, which shows you again that there's no cohesive kind of plot on the part of Al Jazeera to subvert America or anything. It's actually a very typical large news organization like CNN. CNN has Arabic, CNN has Farsi, CNN has many other channels all over the world, and you go to different countries, you'll find CNN everywhere in its own language, with its own editorial staff. And on top of that, what they do is they basically steal the best reporters and the best anchors from all the other news stations and pay them more money, and they come and work for Al Jazeera Jazeera English. That's why they won all these awards, because their anchors are Brits and Americans, and because it's Al Jazeera English. Now we have, since I was there in 2013, they opened up Al Jazeera America, and just the other day I was down doing an interview in their studio on 42nd and 8th Avenue in Manhattan. Nice, beautiful, typical news station, news studio. Went in, they powder you up, you sit in front of a screen. In fact, in this case, they were transferring me to Al Jazeera Mubashir, which is a Al Jazeera live station in Arabic that was in Doha, and we were doing a remote interview in Arabic. But anyway, that was fun. But who knows if what I said was comprehensible. But in any case, that's a little bit more about Al Jazeera. Now, of course, you already had a lot. I'm sorry I wasn't here earlier today to hear all the great presentations about Islam and the history and civilizational contributions. And all, I'm sure that based on my personal friendship with many of the presenters, that what they said was accurate, so I'm not going to repeat any of it, hopefully. But just to emphasize again that Islam is not Arabs. Now, most of the people here that you're speaking to today happen to be Arabic speakers. But most Muslims in the world are not Arabs, are not Arabic speakers. Right? Notice the dark 200 plus million, that's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia. Right? None of which are Arabic speakers or Arabs ethnically. So the majority of the Islamic world is not Arabic, so it's worth saying. But the reason that oftentimes we maybe misunderstand Muslims as equating with Arabs is because look at the percentage of Muslims in which countries have the highest percentage of Muslims. Right? You can see it's the Middle East mostly. But not just. Right? If you tell an Iranian or an Afghani or a Pakistani, you call them Arab, they're going to be a little offended. Because they're not Arabs. They don't speak Arabic as a native language. They speak Urdu, they speak Farsi, speak Turkish, speak Tajik, many other languages. So that just, I guess, is a brief introduction. I just thought it was worth saying. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the fun stuff, which is I'm going to try to highlight 3 or 4 of the major American foreign policy choices and actions that have had long-lasting effects on our world and also on kind of tangentially on American Muslims as well. Right, the Iraq War. I like this political cartoon. Right, you can see ISIS kind of growing out of the bombs that were caused by the Iraq War. Well, what does that mean? Right, what this cartoonist was trying to say is that when the U.S. invaded Iraq, right, the media understanding of that invasion was oil. I mean the media understanding in the Middle East. They're looking at the rhetoric that Bush and his cohort was saying at the UN, oh, Saddam Hussein's helping Al-Qaeda, and Saddam Hussein's doing this, and Saddam Hussein's doing that. And they're saying, hey, the U.S. has been talking about Saddam Hussein now for 12 years. At the same time, the U.S. had harsh sanctions on Iraq that was killing Iraqi children. Right? I mean, maybe we've forgotten now, 'cause it's so long ago in a kind of American modern historical consciousness. But before 2003, there was 12 years of the harshest sanctions. Now the harshest sanctions are on Iran, but at that time the harshest sanctions were on Iraq, where Iraq wasn't able to import medical technology or medicines, and tens of thousands of Iraqi children died during that period from 1991 to 2003. So all of a sudden 9/11 happens, Bush starts talking about Iraq, American public was scared, supported his choice, goes into Iraq and basically destroys the country. I mean, the infrastructure was destroyed. They had to rebuild electrical systems, sewage systems. Imagine living with electricity for several hours a day when the temperature in Baghdad in the summer is 120 degrees. It's not fun. Iraq had air conditioning before the Iraq War, right? So, these kind of choices that the American government made furthered instability in Iraq. It destroyed the educational system. There were a generation now of Iraqi children. Think about it. Anybody who's 10 years old in 2003 is now about 22 years old, 23 years old. Their formative years when they needed to have a good quality education, which Saddam Hussein, by the way, provided, despite his dictatorial, maniacal personal traits, that was gone. Right? So now you have a generation of semi-literate, semi-educated people. And what do we know about extremism? Right? One of the things that furthers extremism is lack of education, lack of understanding, lack of access to proper social services. Right? You see grandma die when she's 40-some years old because she can't get her diabetes medicine. Right? And then you see grandma down the street in Fairfield living to 80-something, right, with great health care. I mean, that's an American issue, but you can transfer the concepts very easily into Iraq. You have the few elites that were able to survive and based on their own personal wealth and paying for personal mercenaries to protect their mansions. And you have the rest who were living in unexpected, abject poverty. Right? First 12 years of kind of slow, degrading poverty caused by the American-led sanctions on Iraq, and then extreme poverty caused by the destruction of the American military. I mean, it wasn't a very hard jump. Now, of course, what does that have to do with American Muslims? Well, this is a globalized world. Right? Since in the 1990s, globalization, especially technological and media globalization, has made access to information across the globe very easy. So you have families that are split between part of the family living in Iraq, part of the family living in Chicago, Detroit area, where major Iraqi communities are. What do you think that, one of my best friends, this is a personal anecdote, one of my best friends is an Iraqi man I met in Jordan years ago. After the invasion, his brother was first snatched up by the American military because he was 20-some years old, so anybody in their 20s was pretty much take them and put them in jail for a while to see if they're a terrorist or not. A very blunt object type approach. Spent several years in prison, then when the Americans turned over the prison system to the Iraqis after about 2005, 2006, spends another 4 or 5 years in prison because the Iraqi authorities were extorting money from his family, saying, "Oh, give us $10,000, right? So he's hearing all this while living in America. It's not something where we can isolate American foreign policy choices from the effects it can have on the attitudes that people will have living in the U.S. when they, or at least a feeling of kind of insecurity can form in the American Muslim population, at least the part that has relatives in the Middle East. If they feel like, well, I'm an American, but then my tax money's going to bomb my family's house, right? I mean, it's the kind of thing that can erode a sense of loyalty and patriotism. Right? Now, I'm not asking, most of you aren't American foreign policy makers, but it's important for the sake of understanding that sometimes when you hear people in your community talking about conspiracy theories, which are rampant, there's lots of conspiracy theories out there. Conspiracy theories. The U.S. was behind 9/11. The Jews were behind everything. You can go on and on, but you have to understand that when the trajectory of American foreign policy in the Middle East, at least, has been on the whole negative, then there's going to be a tendency to think, well, if the U.S. is doing this over there, why isn't it doing it here? Right? If we find out that the New York Police Department was spying on all these mosques in Queens and Brooklyn, well then, what does that tell us about the U.S. government's feeling toward us? Right? Then, should we feel safe here? Right? So that, I guess, is one of the major effects that I want to emphasize, which is a sense of insecurity and fear within the American Muslim community which is why I love doing events with Dr. Abdul Shakur, because he always emphasizes to the, especially when we've been in front of Muslim audiences, that you guys shouldn't feel unsafe here. This is a land with a rule of law. And you guys are the law enforcers, right? So that's why it's great to be here with you and help, to kind of further this idea that you're in the community, right? So you need to be aware of the feeling that might be there, depending on which community it is, of insecurity or concern, right? Just like any other community that's gone through historical oppression, like the African American community. I mean, there's a good reason why there's a lot of serious reservations on the part of African Americans toward the police. Do I need to get into all that's happened in the last couple of years? Right? So you can analogize to the Muslim community as well in some ways. Do you want to jump in?
Would you say that the Patriot Act has hurt the Muslim community more than any other community in the country?
The Patriot Act, that's one of my other points that, I don't have to, I can go into it for a long time, but yeah, the Patriot Act, I think was kind of another blunt object. It was a broad tool that was, there was probably parts of it that were necessary and important. Because before 9/11, there was this kind of, there was a lot of money transfers going to terrorists, let's put it that way, right? And so kind of locking down where money's going and securing that more has been important. And I'll say that that's not just from the American side. In Saudi Arabia today, if you want to give a donation, and Mahmoud can correct me if I'm wrong on this. This is my understanding from several of my Saudi friends, said that if you want to give your donation, you have to swipe a card so they can track who you are. You can't just drop money in a box and then that money disappears somewhere like the offering plate, right? You have to swipe your card and identify, and that way you identify yourself. So generally a tightening up of that kind of underground financial networking, financing some terrorist groups wasn't a bad thing. But this kind of blunt, broad, it's like war on terror ended up being kind of the equivalent of a national stop and frisk for Muslims, I think. I can't tell you how many of my friends, when I travel with them and they are not look like me, I'll just say that, get stopped for a little extra time at the airports. And then everybody says, oh, we're not profiling. Yeah, right, okay. Well, why? Why? Constantly, right? I have a friend who he's a British citizen. He grew up in Britain. He's Iraqi by origin, but he's 90, let's say, since he was 5 years old, he's lived in Britain. Now he's 30. He has Malta, but he gets stopped every single time he comes to the States, even though he's consulted with the CIA. So I don't know what that means, I'm not in the U.S. government. But anyway, we don't have to read this, but the summary is that, terrorist groups are part of the reason. What they do is they basically play upon that fear. So if fear is instilled in the Muslim community, or a sense of, maybe better to say a sense of instability or insecurity is formed in the American Muslim community, a radical or somebody that's an outlier that might otherwise nobody would listen to him, all of a sudden might get an ear with some people by playing on that fear and emphasizing it. Oh, look what the American government's doing. Oh, look what they're doing to this person. Oh, isn't that so horrible, those kids they bombed in Yemen? Which all is true. These things happen, right? Oh, I don't understand why the U.S. government isn't doing something about Assad, who's killed 50,000 children or something, as president of Syria. Well, they don't really care about you, right? It's not, and that isn't something that's, what I want to emphasize is that's not something unique to militants or terrorists in the Islamic context. That's the same kind of thing the KKK was doing for years. Oh, the evil Washington government, the evil Washington government up there, they want to take away your rights and kind of emphasizing the otherness of you, right? You're not really a fully American citizen. So that kind of, these fundamentalist or extremist movements are not, I would say they're no different, right, regardless of what religion it is. So don't get fooled into thinking it's something particularly Islamic or that it's really related to the Islamic religion at all. It's certainly not. I mean, there's no good basis for making an argument that Islamic terrorism is Islamic, just as there's no real basis for saying, you know, it's like you said, Timothy McVeigh or some of these, this guy in, what's his name, the most recent one, Roof, was that his name? I don't even want to remember his name, the guy that shot the people in the church in Charleston. I mean, calling him Christian is just, okay, maybe he, part of his, like, his identity was Christian, or he, as part of how he formed his identity, but, you know, emphasizing his Christianness would be really strange, considering he went into a church and killed a bunch of Christians while they're praying. Just like a guy went into a mosque in Kuwait last week and blew himself up and killed a bunch of Muslims, and he was a Muslim. So can you call him a Muslim? Well, okay, he identified himself as a Muslim. Big deal. Right? I mean, again, this is just some kind of general thoughts on that. I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. I really couldn't help myself here. Okay? This I know it's a little trite. I get good laughs out of it in my classes at UB, but you know, I mean, this is my point. Right? Somebody's using, just because somebody's using the religion or identifying, you know, talking about Jesus or talking about Muhammad, doesn't mean they represent all Muslims or all Christians, right? So I guess that's kind of the broader thing. So sorry, hopefully I'm not too offending anybody there. But anyway, if you like chewing on stick, it's totally fine. I do that sometimes too. It's more the point here of the point of the unaccepting of cultures other than their own, right? That's a commonality. Now, there's a few places in the world that are going through current crisis. And the similarity is, in terms of U.S. foreign policy, the similarity is that the U.S. will prop up, has historically, over the last 50 years or so or more, propped up dictators, right? What do I mean by that, right? In Egypt, there was a guy there named Mubarak who was there for 31 years, I think, that's right, something like that, around that, 30 years. That enacted emergency laws that he never got rid of. Emergency laws that meant, and you guys are all law enforcers, so you appreciate this. It would be as if in the U.S. suddenly we suspended habeas corpus and we're like, oh, hey, you want to pull somebody over, drag him out of his car and shoot him? Okay, you know, whatever. He was a criminal, right? Yo, you want to throw him in jail and leave him there for 10 years without trial, right? No, okay, because it's an emergency. So it's similar to the Patriot Act, but much, much, much stronger. He allowed those to last for 30 years, and at the same time received billions of dollars in American military support. Right? With, what did he do? He ran a one-party political system where he was the president for life. Right? He ran a very strong secret police to spy on any group. He didn't allow any opposition political parties or anything like that. But he was the strong man, and that's the commonality, is the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East at least, and not just outside of the Middle East. In Indonesia, they supported a guy named Suharto for 30 years, who was also just like Mubarak. Right? You can go to many, many countries in the world. Central Asia, they're still supporting strong men there, and the Stans, or Kazakhstan, the former Soviet republics. So when the U.S. is viewed as the president of the U.S. is seen shaking hands with a guy who everybody in the population knows is a dictator, and the American Muslims who, say, Egyptian Americans that came here from Egypt and live in this country, who have family living there, living under a dictatorship, and they're living here in a democracy, but their taxes are going to support a dictator who's oppressing their own family members. These are big problems. And again, I'm not asking you to fix them necessarily, but all of us can play a small part in fixing the problems by becoming aware that there is a problem, right? There is a problem with American foreign policy. Right? There's the U.S., Egypt's rulers with military links. That's Hosni Mubarak I was talking about. Look at Hosni Mubarak's party in 2010 won 81% of the vote. Have you ever heard of anybody winning 81%? Well, guess what? It gets even better. After they had a democracy for 1 year, and this guy, and they actually had different results, right? Competitive elections. There was a coup, and these were all the guys that ran for president, I think, right? Isn't that right, guys? Some of the Egyptians here can tell me. Some of the candidates, anyway. Right? Morsi wins. They have a runoff election between him and Shafiq. He won. He wins. Becomes the president. Skip all this. That was the Freedom and Justice Party. He was the president for 1 year. This guy overthrows him. Military man, General Sisi, right? Who then holds a second election. 97%, wow, he must be really loved by the Egyptian people. I mean, this is democracy at work, right? I'm being sarcastic, but the point is that this is all perceived through the lens of, hey, what kind of hypocritical government are we living under here in America that talks about democracy, democracy, and the 4th of July, and freedom, and, you know, rule of law, and then supports a guy like this? I mean, I'm not just preaching, you know, it's my smile there. Anyway, that's Egypt, right? That's one example. Of course, the big one that Abdul Shakur already mentioned is Palestine. I mean, this is an old, long-standing, not that old, long-standing problem. It goes back 60-some years, right? You can see 1897, the entire population of Palestine, right, was not Jewish. Now, that's not entirely true. There was like 15,000 Arab Jews who spoke just like he said, who were Arab ethnically, Arabic culturally, but Jewish religiously, who did live in this land for 2,000 years. But the green, the dark green, is the expansion of settler Jews that came from outside of the land, mainly Europe, Eastern Europe, Russia, and then, of course, after the Holocaust, Western Europe, the survivors. And over time, through war and conquest and the support, especially after 1967 of the U.S., before 1967, the U.S. really didn't support Israel that much. They gained support from a lot of different places, Czechoslovakia, Soviet Union. But now, since 67, you can see, look what's happened. You have a tiny little bit of land, light yellow, that's left to the Arab Palestinians, and the majority of the land is Israeli Jewish. Now here, American Muslims living in America, especially in the greater New York area, encounter Jewish neighbors and friends all the time, American Jews, right, who are American and Jewish religiously, just like those Arab Jews were Arab and then Jewish religiously. But there's this strange, long, and if you don't have any time to go into it, connection between Israel and the United States now that's becoming stronger and stronger for various reasons, where again the U.S. is giving, you know, massive financial aid and all kinds of other support to the Israeli government, who then turns around and does things like the Gaza, right, the Gaza wars, right, just in the last 7 years, right, from 2008 to 2014, thousands of Palestinians were killed in these conflicts with Hamas in Gaza. The Israelis lost, relatively a handful of people, I mean, in comparison statistically. And you know, the whole way it's portrayed in the American media and the way that Arabs and Hamas are viewed as the enemy and evil versus the Israelis, who are the noble democratic country, is a bit disingenuous, frankly, because there are democratic processes in Arab countries right now, and in Palestine itself, before this 2008 conflict in 2006, there was a democratic election in which this one party called Fatah won a portion of the election, and the other group, Hamas, won another percentage. And normally what happens in a democracy is those two people share power then. Find some way to do a shared power agreement. But Israel and the U.S., with its U.S. support, actually pushed Hamas out and supported the one group that actually lost the election to marginalize them. And so there was an opportunity where here was the Palestinians in the process of forming a robust democratic system for themselves, and it was shortcut by American foreign policy, or at least strong support for Israeli policy. So we don't have time to go into all the different complicated issues at play here, but let me just say one thing, which is that the Palestinian issue is more about water than it is about anything else, water and resources. Because if you see the areas of the most Israeli settlements in what's left of Palestine, which is the West Bank, are mostly around water springs and the water aquifers. It's the more water-rich area. And if you know anything about the Middle East, which a lot of you guys do, it's very dry. So water is like gold. But in any case, so the Palestinian issue. And the Palestinian issue is the most long-standing, continuous problematic issue. So it's the one that's in the forefront of most Muslims' mind across the globe, apart from just the Arab Muslims. Because it's been going on for 60-some years, where you see, and it's, again, it's an excuse for extremists to use as propaganda as well, right? So the U.S. foreign policy really, and this is a bunch of stuff I don't have time to get into, but anyway, that's the election results. You can see there was competitive elections in Palestine amongst the Palestinians in 2006, but 9 years later, that's all been, there's Bill Clinton, Oslo Accord 1993, 22 years later, I would say the Oslo Accords are 100% dead. The results of them really were a shortcut. Another big issue, of course, is Iran. Right? Iran's a very complicated country, but the whole here's an example. I'll talk about Iran in terms of American effects on Americans and American Muslims. So Iran since 1979 has been considered an enemy of the U.S. All media energy has been poured towards demonizing Iran. Not just demonizing it, but making it monolithic, like Iran is all the same. I'll go into why it's not true at all in a second. But what's the effect of that over a 35-year period? What do you imagine would be the effect if every day, if you're an American, like I'm 37 years old. So Iran became the Islamic Republic when I was 2 years old. If I hadn't studied the Middle East for a long time and lived there and so on, what do you imagine the effect would be if every day somebody in the media was portraying Iran as this evil country that says death to America and hates Americans and it sponsors terrorism and this and that? I mean, it's obvious what the effect's going to be. But I'll tell you statistically what the effect is that Iran is the country, when Gallup polled Americans on what countries they had the most favorable view of and what countries they had the least favorable view of, the most favorable, I think, was Canada, around something like that. But the least favorable country, only 9% of Americans had a positive view of Iran, and just a couple years ago. Now, is it possible that Iran is that evil? Right? Maybe, but probably not. But that, kind of can affect not just the American community generally with their view of, because then Iran, of course, is the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? So then Islam is also kind of tainted by this view. But if you're growing up here as an American Muslim and you're not an Iranian, you yourself may also have a complicated feeling towards Iran, right? So Iran and the U.S. foreign policy towards it of kind of isolating it is very odd. Because if you know anything about the Iranian community in America, the majority of them are doctors, lawyers, engineers, professors. I mean, per capita, Iranians in the U.S. are some of the most educated and almost entirely within the higher socioeconomic classes. And so how do we explain that? Right? Are they kind of closet terrorists here, for 30 years, forming their cells so they can, I don't know, run banks or something? It's not really, and what the main explanation is that Iranian society is split between three main groups. You have a group that's pro-government, a group that's pro the old government, and a group that's in the middle. It's pretty much pro-reform. But the point is that there are also other problems, which was the U.S. foreign policy again. 1980s, and again, now this is long, distant history, or maybe before some of you were alive, and I remember when I was a kid, you'd see like Time magazine. I remember I was in art class as a child, and the teacher said, "Oh, make a collage." So I was into like tanks and guns as a little kid, and so I picked like a picture of an Iraqi on a tank and an Ayatollah Khomeini and Saddam Hussein, and I found it years later, and I was like, oh my gosh, this was just floating around the art class in 1980s in my school, elementary school, because it was in the news at that time. The fact is that the U.S. supported Saddam Hussein. Not 100%, but they supported him pretty strongly with money, weapons. They looked the other way when he used chemical weapons on Iranians. Right? So if you're an Iranian living in the U.S., an Iranian Muslim or Iranian regardless, because Iran's diverse as well, although it's mostly Muslim, you might remember that on July 4th in 1987, the U.S. military blew an Iranian civilian aircraft out of the sky and killed 239 people. That happened, right? And it was buried, and Reagan basically said it was a mistake, and he pardoned the guy who did it, even though there's lots of evidence that it was intentional. But that's just the end of the Iran-Iraq war. More than a million people died. Those are the parents of children that are now my age, right? So again, these are all kind of problematic choices. That this is just the diversity of Iran. Right? You know that Iran has Arabs, right? All along here is native Arabic speakers. These are all the various different linguistic, ethnic aspects of Iran. So, you know, this isn't a class on Iran, but the point is that, yeah.
I think the hype of 1980, you got to realize the American public, after the taking of the embassy in 79, the hype was, you know, Iran was the bad guy.
Yeah.
And that's where our culture was going at that time. Let's fast forward to the paranoid where we are today with Iran. We know these people want nuclear capabilities. They want to be the big boys on the block like Pakistan and Turkey and Israel and all of them that are trying to get their hands on an atomic bomb. The thing we have to worry about is the terrorist organizations getting some spin-off material from these rogue states.
Well, that's the big. I think that's the big problem, which is that go back to this guy, right? This is the supreme leader of Iran. He's consistently issued statements saying it's against Islam. Nuclear weapons are against Islam. It's against Islam to have these weapons. They should be gone from the whole globe. He's called for Israel to get rid of theirs because Israel's known to have them. Everybody knows. That's the open secret in the Middle East. Everybody knows Israel has 250 nuclear weapons. They have nuclear submarines, everything. So Pakistan has it. Their other neighbor, right? Neighbor of Iran. Israel's and Iran are regional competitors. I agree with the part of your statement that everybody wants to be the big boy on the block. Saudi Arabia wants to be the big boy. Iran wants to be the big boy. Israel would like to be. Egypt would like to be. Who else is up? Turkey would like to be. Those are the 4 or 5 major players. But there's no actual ironclad evidence that Iran is currently, or since at least 2003, trying to make a nuclear weapon. They've openly said, we want nuclear power. We want to be a nuclear state in the sense of nuclear power. We want to do it for medical isotopes. We want to do it for electric production, economic self-sufficiency, which would help them be stronger in the region. They could sell more of their oil, become a regional power. There's no doubt they want to be a regional power. That's why they intervene in other...
Uranium.
What's that?
They're not enriching uranium.
Well, they're enriching uranium, but they never enrich it to 97%, which is what you need for a bomb, right? There's no evidence. The IAEA, the Iranian Atomic Energy, or not Iranian, International Atomic Energy Agency, they said they haven't enriched it to that level. The concern, and it's a legitimate concern, is that they could, but again, Iranians, because they graduate more engineers than any country except for, I believe, the U.S. in the world, has the know-how and the human capital that unless you're content to kill off 60 million people, which is or 70 million people, which is maybe 79 now, is the population of Iran, you're not going to get rid of the technological know-how to create weapons if there was will to do it. But I'm not convinced that there's actually that will. I think a lot of that is actually just propaganda, and it doesn't just come from the US government or Israel, it also comes from Saudi Arabia. If you read WikiLeaks, Saudi Arabian king a few years ago said, oh, you guys need to cut off the head of the snake, and he was referring to Iran when he's speaking to diplomats. Now, of course, WikiLeaks, we're not supposed to look at that. Maybe you guys aren't allowed legally, I don't know. But I'm an independent academic at university, so until the president of UB tells me to stop reading, I'm going to keep reading them. But anyway, he won't. That's the beauty of being an academic. We don't get paid, but we can like have some freedom, in that way. But yeah, I don't think, I would say that that's part of the problem, again, is that when Iran is highly misunderstood. The Iranian population is deeply pro-American. That's the big, that's the thing about Iran, is that if you see the youth of Iran, you guys should watch Anthony Bourdain. He did a show where he went to Iran, right? Amazingly pro-American. They know more about America than Americans know about America. Jon Stewart did a show years ago where he sent his guy, Jason Jones, there in 2009, this amazing 4-episode thing on Iran. But the point is that, yes, the Iranian government's interests are different than the US government's interests. And they're not going to become best friends overnight as governments. But the US foreign policy has worked with dictators and people that aren't Democrats and people that don't support democracy for years. Nearly 100 years. They've been working with various dictators. So why not work with Khamenei as much as they're working with the kings in Gulf states? There's not a reasonable answer to that question other than that maybe the US government feels that Iran's interests clash too much with their own interests in the region.
I think they're getting also pressure from Israel because a lot of the religious leaders in Iran have said that Israel shouldn't exist.
Well, that's something else, by the way, which is that when Iran says Israel shouldn't exist, that's a commonly held view in most of the Middle East. Let's be honest. Because of the history. If I had time to go through the history of Palestine, it's the same view that Native Americans would have of the United States. It's like, hey, guys, you showed up, you stole our land, you massacred some of us, the rest of us run away, or melded into the population, and now we're gone, and here we are. That's just a reality. But again, that doesn't mean just because somebody says, I'm a historian, right? Do I think that it was right that the Spanish settlers came into South America and did what they did, or that the British and French and Spanish came into North America and did what they did? No, I don't think it was right on a human rights level and as a human being. But as a historian, I say, well, it happened. And that's what most people accept and understand, is people in the Middle East aren't in any way stupid or misunderstanding that Israel's a strong state and it's probably not going anywhere anytime soon. Right? And Iran knows that too. I'm sure they know that too. But a lot of it is domestic politics too. Because the Iranian leaders will say that sometimes in the midst of elections to stir up votes for their own self. And it's like these guys saying crazy things. Like, what was Donald Trump talking about Mexicans for? That was insane, right? But there's some group of Americans that still cling to this idea that the foreigners are going to come here and steal our jobs and ruin our country and this. And he was catering to that. The stuff he said was wildly extreme, but Iranian has a political system with politicians, and these guys say what they want, people want to hear.
I think you can highlight that now with the American government talking to Cuba, talking about dictatorships.
I don't have time to, yes. Well, look, guess what? The U.S. is probably going to sign a nuclear agreement with Iran, and all of a sudden Iran's going to come back into the fold, and all this 35 years of Iran, the big boogeyman, 30 years from now will be kind of like, just like Castro. He was so evil, and now it's like, all right, what? So, again, I don't have time to show this because I want to wrap up and give you guys time to talk a little bit more about it. But this is a lady who was, do you guys remember the time, the 9/11, the so-called 9/11 mosque? Do you remember that? That whole controversy a few years ago at 9/11 at Ground Zero? Sorry, they called it the Ground Zero Mosque. It wasn't actually what it was anyway, but Not to mention the fact there are lots of mosques already around Ground Zero that have been there for 30, 40, 50 years, not causing any problems. And the people that did 9/11 were, I hate to say this because people in the audience, but they were, if we're not too much into conspiracy theories, they were all Saudi and Egyptian, not Americans, not American Muslims. Nothing to do with the American Muslims that have been in Ground Zero for 50 or 60 years. Anyway, there's this lady named Daisy Khan and her husband who were the ones trying to found this Islamic center to further tolerance and peace and understanding. And it was, but the reaction to it was what was crazy. Where you had Peter King in Long Island, or wherever he's based, talking about this is the Ground Zero mosque, this is a terrorist haven, and we need to stop it. This is an insult to Americans. Wait a minute, these people were Americans. They were Americans trying to set up a house of worship, like every other house of worship that we have on every block in this country. So, again, but why was that even part of the American talk? I think it was because there's this connection between what America does overseas, how they're perceived in other countries' Muslim communities versus American Muslim community, and I think that's the biggest thing. And again, this is a link to, if you want to read it, an open letter to al-Baghdadi. Do we all know who al-Baghdadi is? Abu Bakr, the caliph, that in quotes, the ISIS guy, right? ISIS leader. This is an open letter written by Muslim leaders, religious leaders all over the globe, denouncing him and saying everything about him is un-Islamic and he needs to repent and stop everything he's doing. Right? It's open, it's online, you can just read it if you'd like, but it's very nicely written and very well researched and written. So whenever somebody says to you, or whenever you start thinking or have the tendency to think, why aren't there more moderate Muslims out there? Why aren't they denouncing all these terrorists? Guess what? They are. Right? They are. In their communities, in their mosques, in their leaders. Right? The only one who's not denouncing it are these outlier cuckoos, right? Just like every country, every religious community has them, who are able to capitalize on, people who are disenfranchised, poor, semi-educated. Maybe some of the leaders are educated, but the general followers of ISIS, I would say, are not very well educated on the whole. So I'll leave it at that, and we can talk a little bit more, if you'd like, about that, or if you have any questions or thoughts on that. I think I started a little late, so. Yeah.
Where do you think the American-Iranian relation is going? Will Iran 5-10 years from now will be our best and biggest ally in the Middle East?
No, I don't think Iran will be our biggest ally in the Middle East, but I think that the U.S. has realized that Iran is never leaving Iraq, right? They're never leaving Iraq. Iran is embedded in Iraqi society because there are lots of Iraqis who are from Iranian descent, and the majority of Iraqis are Shiite Muslims, and Iran's a Shiite state, and the most holy sites for Shiite Islam are based in Iraq. So, and Iran, moreover, doesn't want Iraq to become an enemy of it again and kill 1 million of its people, like in the Iran-Iraq war. So it's pushing their border, making a buffer zone. You create a state that's, if you can create a country or influence a country that's your neighbor to be your friend, then you have less border to worry about. Same thing with us in Canada, right? We fought a war with the British about Canada back in the 1800s, and to set that border. But now Canada's our best buddy, right? As long as you keep Mexico happy, then we have both our borders secure. Right? Iran's doing the same thing with Iraq, and I think that it's entirely unrealistic to think that Iran's influence in Iraq is going to disappear. So unless the U.S. wants Iraq to be a completely unstable zone to whatever's left of it, it's controlled by the government, that's filled with terrorist training camps, and I think the U.S. realizes they have to at least come to some kind of accommodation with Iran. The question is, to me, is how much will Iran be willing to come towards the U.S.? Because the hardliners in Iran are really, they prefer, for their own self-preservation, to keep the great Satan out there, right? The rhetoric about the great Satan, right? The death to America kind of rhetoric. So I think that that the U.S. will come to some kind of accommodation with Iran, kind of like they do with Pakistan. The U.S. isn't really Pakistan's best friend, right? Best ally, but they work with them. They work with the government. Maybe. I mean, that's my guess. I mean, it's not clear yet. I mean, the whole nuclear negotiation could fall apart, and they could maintain the sanctions, and it could be disastrous on a lot of levels. But I don't think so. I think they tried their best when it came to impoverishing Iran and putting sanctions on them, and the Iranian government was much too smart for them. You know, Saddam Hussein was stupid, frankly. When it came to geopolitical strategy, he allowed himself to be isolated by the whole international community to the point where he was weak enough that they could do what they did to their country, his country. Iran built relationships with Central Asian republics, with India, with Japan, with China, with Russia, right? So the U.S., despite their attempt to make it another Iraq in terms of sanctions and impoverishing them, they weren't. I mean, Iranians aren't poor. They aren't like Iraqis. Right? Their educational system is intact. Their infrastructure is fairly robust, very robust. Their healthcare system is good, right? They provide 97% of Iranian women are literate, which is higher than any other Middle Eastern country for women. I mean, it's a paradoxical nation. We could go on about it for a long time, but I think that the U.S. is just realizing they have to at least deal with them. You know, I'd be shocked if they were our best buddy. I don't think they're going to replace Israel and Saudi Arabia anytime soon. I don't think. Maybe, I don't know.
The reason I'm asking because there is this, not belief out there that the real threat, if you consider this as a threat, the real threat will come from the Sunni Islam. So if we could take these guys as our buddies, that will be our policeman in the area.
Well, I would say this, that there are a lot of British Shiite Muslims from Iraq that support that view and further it, at least with the British government that I know personally, who go and tell the British government, oh, watch those Sunnis, you know, they're the ones that are dangerous. The problem is that ISIS is a Sunni organization, right? Al-Qaeda is a Sunni origin. It's not Sunni in the sense of Sunnah at all. It's not mainstream, but it doesn't come out of the Shiite tradition. It comes out of the Sunni tradition. And so ISIS and some of these other extremist groups that happen to have embedded themselves or come out of the Sunni, of course that's not shocking because Sunni Islam is the vast majority of Muslims. 85% of Muslims at least are Sunni. So of course if the majority of Muslims in the world, there's 1 billion, maybe almost 2 billion Muslims, and the majority are Sunni, then you're going to expect that if there are extremist groups, are going to come out of that side because of just statistics. But yes, some Shiites have been emphasizing that for their own benefit. I don't think the U.S. is going to view it that way, though, because why would they support? I mean, they're supporting Sisi, right? He's Sunni, right? I mean, in Egypt. I mean, they're supporting they're supporting the Gulf countries, which are, you know, except for Kuwait and Saudi has some. I guess
So did the State Department know all of this? Why would they even get rid of?
It's a big, you know, this whole issue with the State Department. The State Department does know. That's
the power vacuum would create ISIS.
I used to think the State Department was stupid. I used to have a negative view. I was like, oh, he's looking down on these guys. These guys don't know anything. Then I met a lot of State Department guys who had PhDs and masters in Middle East studies, fluent in Arabic, fluent in Farsi, super smart, very understanding of Middle East politics. And then it started making me rethink, well, what is the hidden drivers of power in our own democracy, right? If the State Department's not driving policy, because a lot of State Department people are very pro-Palestinian, by the way, but they can't say a word on the record because it's not American political stance right now. then I thought, well, what is driving it? Is it the Defense Department? Sort of, maybe. Is it outside private contractors, big business? I'm not sure. I mean, that's like the $1,000,000 question. but it's not. Many historians have been talking about these things and written many books on them, about the effects of different policies and unintended consequences, and it's there,
Just to follow up here, the founding fathers of this country didn't believe that the U.S. should interfere that much, or should not interfere in the affairs of other countries, which wasn't the case through history. And since, this is, how do you think you said, this is your major of politics, etc. How do you see, what is a resolution here, or how do you solve this dilemma of interests versus ethics or principles? The U.S., the Constitution, we believe in democracy, human rights, these are our core values. At the same time, when it comes to foreign affairs, then we move the angle to interests. If there is some compromise here, it's not the problem only in the Middle East, it's the problem all over the world. Okay? And this happened with Cuba and South America, supporting dictatorships. If there is a middle point to reach between what constitutes interest and what constitutes ethics and principles.
Yeah,
Guide your foreign affairs.
I think that, the more events like this, the more discussion, the more general education about U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Muslims, vis-a-vis the Middle East, or any group, and analogies with other things is a key component, because if you have these kind of courses, even as possibly requirements, in school, the America is a democracy, and if people's public opinion shifts, then it'll force the government to shift. Just like gay marriage, just like lots and lots of other things, civil rights, and anti-slavery movement, and a lot of other movements in the U.S. People can change, but it starts with breaking down stereotypes and also being realistic and understanding what's going on, right, with open eyes, not just kind of blind patriotism. You guys are all working in law enforcement. You're here to serve your communities. You're here to serve the country, and we all thank you for it, because you're putting your lives on the line. Nobody thinks that, but that doesn't mean that shouldn't mean blind patriotism of just like viewing certain Americans as not as American as others. Right? If you start viewing them that way, then the reaction might be they may become more that way. It's a natural human response. If I'm attacked, I might want to attack you back. Right? And so it's like that. I think it's just a gradual change has to happen. But I also think, and this is crazy to say this, but I think that probably in terms of the U.S., as long as the U.S. is the dominant superpower in the world, economically and politically, then the U.S. is constantly going to be looking to preserve that position until it loses it. Right? So as long as the U.S. is the predominant power in the world, then there is going to be ugly choices they make in terms of economic interests. I think a lot of these military and propping up dictators is also very much linked to maintaining the economic position of the U.S. Right? Because a dictator, if he's in power and he's your friend, then he'll sign a special contract for oil or some other natural resource with you that you might not get from a guy like Tsipras, or however you pronounce his name, the Greek prime minister now, who's like giving the middle finger to the European Union, right? You don't want somebody like that who's not your friend to be in power, because all of a sudden your economic ties to that country might go down. So better to support a dictator who at least will be, it's kind of like, was it LBJ or was it Franklin Roosevelt? I think FDR said, well, yeah, he is a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch, right? I'm sorry for my crude language, that's a quote, right? Talking about Stalin, exactly, right? So it's like Stalin, a known dictator, killer of millions of his own people, but he's on our side, right? He fulfills a specific interest we need for our security or for our economy or something. So I would say that we can expect rapid extreme change. And the reason I say that is because Obama, as much as he's done many, many major changes domestically in the US, he's overseen more domestic policy changes in the last 7 years, 6, 7 years, than I can remember of any president. I mean, you know, so many things he's changed if you think about it. I mean, changing not just with the various rights in healthcare and gay rights and a lot of other things, but with economic issues, right? Reforming, you know, pushing through some bank reform and some other things. But foreign policy-wise, Obama hasn't been, you know, let's just say he hasn't been the peacemaker that the Nobel Peace Prize Committee intended in 2009. He ramped up drone warfare in Yemen and Pakistan, killing, you know, many, many people. He, you know, he actually increased troops in Afghanistan for a while. He did wind down the Iraq War, but in a weird way. But, you know, I mean, he's been pretty much a wartime president, and he's also supported and is currently supporting, like I said, Sisi, right? General Sisi. I refuse to call him president. I'll call him General Sisi in Egypt. Obama's supporting him. You know, so that then begs the question of, when it comes to foreign policy, how much does the president change anything, regardless if he's Democrat or Republican? I mean, my answer, at least in the last 30 years, is not much. Maybe sometimes one party be a little bit more extreme, but, you know, George Bush invaded Iraq, but Bill Clinton was the one that oversaw the sanctions over Iraq for his whole presidency. And George Bush Sr. was the one that started it. So, anyway, sorry to end on kind of a depressing note, but I hope it gave you at least some thoughts on, you know, issues with the way that foreign policy affects the Muslim communities. So,
Thank you, guys.